I'm Mitch.
I'm Keith.
And this is the Layman's Term Show. The Layman's Term Show, where a couple lay people, not clergy, talk about where life and faith intersect and have some fun conversations. This week on the Layman's Term Show, we're talking about guilt. Keith, what are you guilty of?
Well, that's an intro right there.
Yes, it is. All right, let's start at the top.
Guilt is an interesting thing because you can be guilty. You can feel guilt for doing something. You can feel guilt for not doing something. You can feel guilt for all various reasons. Whether it's
There's even false guilt.
Well, that's what I was trying to think.
That's where you're headed. False guilt.
Like where you're guilty about something you shouldn't be guilty of,
or you
shouldn't feel guilty of, right?
Yeah, or you feel. So there's guilty by association, and then there's feeling guilty by association. You know, when the bus driver yells at the kids at the back of the bus, and even though you weren't back there, it kind of ruins your day at school.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
Yeah. I
feel like, man, we're bad kids.
We're bad kids.
But I wasn't the actively bad child.
Yeah. Or maybe you were doing the same thing. You just weren't the one that got yelled at for it.
That's like convicting guilt.
Yeah.
That's like, you need to pay attention to that.
Yeah. No, it could be, guilt can be something as simple as, this has happened the other day. Parker, my 3-year-old, if you're eating something, he's hungry and he wants what you have.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
I gave him some of my sandwich.
Right. Like he's like, all of a sudden he's like, I'm hungry.
Yeah, it was a hook and ladder from Firehouse Sub. It was delicious.
Not a sponsor, but should be.
They should be. I gave him a little piece of the wheat bread.
Yeah.
And some turkey.
Lurkey. It's like, so I have to sneak food around him, otherwise he's just eating.
Curvaceous.
Yeah, So I have this thing around Halloween candy that when I'm cooking, I have to eat as well.
Okay.
I don't know why. If you're cutting up a bell pepper, half the bell pepper goes into my mouth versus, the dish, right? So, we're cooking and it's nothing I can apparently eat. I'm making breaded chicken
raw
and pasta,
hamburger, right?
right? Like I can't eat this. So, I go with a bowl of candy and I got to sneak a piece. Otherwise Parker's going to be like, oh, I'm hungry. I want candy, So I'm like sneaking this piece of candy and I pop it in my mouth and I turn around and there's Parker standing there.
So
and he looks at me and he goes, what you have? I'm like, nothing. He's like, you have candy. And I'm like, oh man, like instant guilt, right? Like instant guilt. So, but yeah, like, should you feel guilty as an adult for having a bite-sized Snickers before dinner? No, it's your prerogative. You can do what you want, but I felt guilty.
You felt guilty.
Crazy, isn't it? Now,
well, so we have two. You brought up an interesting point there. Because we have a couple different reflexes whenever it comes to guilt, things we do. So we either suppress it, push it down, suppress it, ignore it, pretend it's not there, pretend we don't feel guilty, right? Or we retreat to a narrative.
Oh.
A narrative that would say, well, I'm the adult. It's my prerogative.
I see what you're doing there.
Right? You've now showed an example of justification through retreating to a narrative.
Yeah.
To excuse yourself of the guilt you're feeling.
Yes.
All right? So now, we're talking pretty amateur kid stuff right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a benign
we can
example.
we can do this at a larger scale.
I have a realization or a thought that just popped in my head as you were talking, and I want to get your feeling. They say anger is not a primary emotion. Anger is the result of
anger is what happens after you've suppressed guilt long enough.
Well,
we're headed there.
That can be, but like anger, you don't feel angry, it's a secondary emotion, right?
Yeah.
You're either embarrassed, so then you get angry
Yes.
because you're embarrassed, or whatever, right? Do you think guilt is a secondary emotion?
Well, I think anger is a secondary emotion of guilt. So after you suppress your guilt, so you can rewrite the narrative, right? So then it's out there and you talk about it. All right. So I'm guilty for this thing, but I talk it through. I'm telling everybody about it, and then excusing the jerk cut me off.
Yeah.
Right. Like
Jerk.
I'm excusing my behavior by rewriting the narrative.
Yeah.
That may or may not include the fact that my blinker was not on. Right? Like rewrite if I control the narrative, I can control other folks' perceptions of how my behavior was, and thus justify and kind of excuse away my guilt in my own worldly human terms. Or it could be so bad that I don't think I can rewrite the narrative. I don't think I can produce a narrative that doesn't shade me in a shade of guilt. So then I'm gonna press it down. No one's gonna know about it. I'm not gonna talk about it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna bury it deep inside. Then I think it matures into anger. Because then you're angry with yourself. You're angry over this guilt.
Well, it could be other emotions too than anger, but I can see where you're going. I mean, you could get depressed by it. Whatever you did, that you bury it so deep that you become depressed because you know that you did X, Y, Z, and you haven't atoned for it, or whatever.
And you want to, yeah. And either way, I think it's a direct or indirect change in the narrative. Because if you change that narrative internally, then you can put this anger towards another person.
So is guilt a natural, and I'll try to explain this, but is guilt a natural emotion, or, in other words,
is it a human emotion?
If you steal something, no matter what culture you're from, you feel guilty for doing it, right?
I believe so.
Or is it cultural based, where you only feel guilty because your culture tells you that that you weren't supposed to do the thing?
Well, my belief would be it is part of that thumbprint of God, I like to call it.
Let's get into that. I think I know what you're saying. But.
Part of our human experience, part of the emotion, the design, the made in the image of God, our ability to love the full range and spectrum of the human experience, the human emotions, is this microcosm of God's ability to create and experience, emotions. So maybe like separating us from our relatives in the animal kingdom, we have some of these emotions, and one of them is this feeling of guilt, this understanding, the difference between understanding right and wrong, knowing that murder is wrong. There's species on the planet that do it all the time. And I doubt they have guilt. But our human experience, taking a life, we experience as wrong. At our core, at our being.
Well, you think about the ancient times, like Romans, Spartans, barbarians, and war was very common, right? Very, duels, right? Like a duel to the death. I mean, we had duels in the U.S. till, the 1800s, right? Or 1900s.
Yeah. And then you get into the narrative. Well, it was them or me.
Yeah. So, I mean, so do you think spanning our existence that people instinctively knew what they were doing was wrong? It was just so societally accepted that it was okay.
Yeah, we
Like,
made narrative. We made narrative
They made the excuse that
because there's narratives trying to explain it away all throughout history. Mm-hmm. That tells you the driver for those narratives was the emotion of guilt. There was no guilt. There's no narrative to explain it away.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to think about this like further.
Yeah, if
in
there
my
was
brain.
no guilt, the little M&Ms you swiped the other day,
Snickers.
the miniature, was it the tiny one?
Yeah, it's a little tiny one.
The tiny
Like
one.
the tiny
waist
square.
of a wrapper.
Yeah.
Like Snickers.
It wasn't even the fun size.
No.
It was the smaller
it's actually
size.
not fun.
Yeah.
Getting into it. There's not even enough wrapper to kind of get the
Yeah, it's like
tear
you're
started.
smelling the Snickers. Like
Yeah,
I just had a Snickers.
I just treat it like a sunflower seed. Pop the whole thing in, chew it up, spit out the wrapper.
Spit out the wrapper. So
So that's my hot take on it. Right
Interesting.
there is without our history of narratives glorifying, explaining away actions, violent actions, is a mechanism for processing guilt. Even in the most noble of settings, it's a mechanism for processing guilt.
So, let's spin this conversation a little bit towards our relationship with God.
Yes.
Right, and guilt. Do you think that we naturally approach God with guilt off the bat? In other words, when you're first
You're caught in
understanding
the
God,
headlines.
you're first understanding it, right? You're not a kid, but you're an adult, a teenager, right? And you start to really look and understand about God, and you start to believe. Is it natural to then immediately be guilty or feel guilt? Because, and I'll lay out a list of things, all the stuff you did before you believed, right? All the stuff you continue to do, right? But then just, and I'll give you, kind of my thought is that you're never good enough for God, right? Like that's how I feel. Like I can't be good enough for God, right? And so a lot of I would say a lot of my guilt or approach to God is because maybe not what I've done in the past or maybe what I've done in the present, but the fact that I know in the future, like I can't be perfect, right? Like I can't do everything correctly. So I'm not, you feel not good enough to be in relationship with God.
Enter Jesus.
Yeah.
Keith. Enter Jesus.
Yeah.
Because it's the whole foundation of our faith is we're not good enough. We can't be good enough for God in our current state.
Yeah.
Because I think Andy Stanley said, one of his talks was not a sponsor.
Should be.
was guilt creates this debtor relationship. We even work it into our vocabulary, right? We don't think about it, but I owe them an apology.
Oh, yeah.
I owe them something.
Oh, that's a great
How
point.
can I make it up to them, right? And usually it's because something's been taken, taken advantage of, taken from, and it can't be given back. It can't be returned. It can't be undid. But because it's created this debtor relationship, how we perceive it, we feel like there's something we should be able to do to resolve that.
Dude, I saw this video.
Okay.
Dwayne Johnson, The Rock.
The Rock.
Not a sponsor. Should be.
Should be.
He was telling this story. He went to this gas station, and when he was like first starting to work out and stuff for like over a year, he'd go to this gas station and steal a king size Snickers bar. So back to the Snickers.
Okay.
And that was like his pre-workout, calories or whatever, right? So for a year he would steal this Snickers bar. So he went back in to this gas station and bought out all the candy bars, spent, a couple $1,000s buying out all the candy bars, paid for them, and then left them and said, hey, anybody comes in want a candy bar, give it to them, right?
Okay.
That's what you're talking about. Obviously, he did something, he felt so guilty for it that years later, he had to do something to try to pay for the guilt that he probably felt.
Yep. So when it comes like what Jesus has done for us, we've created this separation that we can't make up for.
Yeah.
We can't undo the wrongs we've done and the hurts we've done to other people that we feel guilty for. And by hurting other people and wronging other people, we're doing that to God. So you can't make up for that without Jesus taking it on himself and taking that punishment for us to clean our slate of all the guilt that we've accumulated and will continue to accumulate. So you have kind of these three options with your guilt. You can deny it completely and live a lie. You can face it, bring it out in the light, face it, and then risk being defined by it. Or your third option is Jesus. And Jesus on the cross took on the condemnation, I would say, the condemnation associated with our guilt. Took it all on himself.
Yeah, and I think maybe a point would be, and you can tell me if you don't agree with this, but it doesn't mean that you give your guilt away, right? Realizing that Jesus' death paid for whatever you should be guilty of.
And now it's okay.
And now it's just okay.
Yeah, that's not what we're saying.
Right, that's not what we're saying. But the feeling of letting the guilt control your life.
Yes.
You should give that up to God. And don't let the guilt control you and push you into a direction. Allow it to be freeing so that you can approach life and approach God in a more loving way.
And make corrective actions where you can,
Sure.
right? Mm-hmm. Make amends best you can. Jesus is saying, bring your guilt to me. Bring your guilt to Jesus with your eyes wide open. Identify, not with a narrative, not with excuses, but here it is. Own it, right? Here it is, back to the sign on Jimmy John's, right?
Jimmy John's.
A good apology has three parts. They're not a sponsor, but if you go there, signs on the wall. I think it's on the south side of the Jimmy John's in Kearney. Three good parts to an apology, Keith.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, we've talked about this before on the podcast. You have to go back and listen to the other
Oh,
episodes.
no. What happened?
It's a teaser alert. But bring your guilt to God, eyes wide open. Bring it to Jesus and say, here it is. I own it. This is what I'm guilty of. No stories, no cover-ups. Bring it out there, and then I think Jesus says, we're going to agree together that you're guilty. We're not saying you're not guilty. You're guilty, but you're not condemned.
Yeah.
That's where I said that.
That's a good point.
So we recognize it. Our eyes are open. We're guilty.
Yeah.
But we're not condemned.
Yeah.
So Jesus is saying, when God sees you because of him, when he sees you, he doesn't see the things you've done. He sees you. for who you are, and he wants you to see all your other relationships the same way he sees them.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. So let's try to sum
Tie
it
a
up,
bow on
tie
it.
a bow on it. So you do something, you feel guilty about it, but instead of suppressing it or instead of trying to write a narrative about it, approach it for what it is, right? Try to make amends the best you can in the situation. Try to change for the future.
Repent.
Right?
Bring it to God.
Bring it to God. Be truly
Accept the forgiveness. Accept the non-condemnation. Accept the acceptance.
Yep.
So that you can forgive yourself.
Yep.
Goes back to our forgiveness discussion.
Yep.
And then chart the course forward.
Right. Yeah, I like that. It's easier said than done.
Correct. Of course.
It's way easier said than done.
But I think a couple steps forward is when you feel the guilt, call it out and recognize when you're writing a narrative to excuse it away.
Yeah. Oof. Self-reflection.
So when you're telling the
So
story,
hard.
in the back of your mind, be thinking, am I telling a
But I
narrative?
am an adult, and I can eat a fun-sized Snickers anytime that I want.
Anytime that he wants. Well, I'm Mitch,
I am Keith.
and this was the Layman's Term Show. Thanks for tuning in.
Later.